All right, how's everyone doing? How's morale? Huh? How we doing? It's great to see you. This is my favorite bee club in the world. It's true. It's because look around, everyone's smiling, everyone's bees are alive, you know? Has anyone here ever bought bees? Maybe you have and don't want to admit it, you know, but most folks here have never bought bees. They've never had to treat bees or feed bees, and they have more bees than they know what to do with, and they're giving them away. Be it forward, you know. So you go North Florida, other parts of the country, it's not the same. It's all about mites. My bees died. I treated them, they still died. I didn't treat them, they died. You know, it's a little more doom and gloom, and it's mites, mites, mites. Talk all the time. It makes me wonder if dog lovers go to dog conventions and spend the whole time talking about fleas. But, so anyway, I warned Lee that I was going to come out singing tonight. You know, with my bee talks, I tend to stick to what I'm good at, and that's talking about myself. But I think I can get you up to speed more with a song. But before I do that, I want you to know that I'm not alone up here. I did bring some of my friends with me. I'm Sam Comfort. I run Anarchy Apiaries, and we make our living with bees these days, selling and raising queen bees. So you all are going to get to hold a queen in your hand tonight.
Are those for sale?
These are for sale, as a matter of fact. Some of them are taking them, but some of them need a home tonight. So if that one doesn't make it back up front, I'm going to check Al's pocket first. You know? All right. Well, I already said that V word, Varroa Mites, and I'm going to talk to you about my experience with bees and how I got into, how come I get to stand at the front of the room and like have the big mouth, you know. Part of that is in thanks of Varroa Mites, you know, which have killed bees for the last 30, 40 years in this country and have spread all the way around the world. So let's start with a song about our friend, the Varroa Mite. It's the Varroa Mite Blues. The Varroa is a little red mite. It comes from Asia, so they say. It's come all the way around the world, and now it's living in the USA. It's looking for a home and living on the comb, comb, comb. Looking for a home and living on the comb. Well, the first time I saw the Varroa, it was sucking on a bee. After a round of brood, I saw it again. It had made a whole family. They're living on the comb and looking for a home. Well, the beekeeper took a pesticide strip and he put it in the hive. Now all the honey and wax are ruined, and the mite, it still ain't died. It's living on the comb and looking for a home. I tried oils and powders and poisons, still the mites are strong. The bees got weak and sick, and now almost all are gone. We ruined their home, we can't leave them alone. Well, the Varroa told the beekeeper, you better get some more bees. A couple of 3-pound packages, make a tasty menu for me. I'll make them my home and make them disease prone. Well, the bees didn't make much comb, and they didn't make much honey. All year long I'm pulling out my hair and spending all of my money. Yes, I'm hooked on bees. Someone help me, please. If anyone should ask you who was it wrote this song, tell them the old beekeeper and all the bees are gone. They left their home looking for cleaner comb. Well, I ain't gonna fuss about nothing no more. I know I can't fight the mites. I'll get out of their way, and then one day the bees will be alright, happy in their home, living on the comb, 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 happy in their home. Just leave them alone. Thanks, good night. All right. That was a true story, you know. And for as good as I tried to make it sound, it wasn't that sweet for me getting into bees, you know. I got into bees when I won my first 6 hives in a poker game, but that's not actually true. It's just the best story I've come up with. It actually really did follow that song, you know. Well, let's go to the beginning. People and bees. Bees and people. What's going on in this relationship? Well, we know about people, we know about bees, and we know about this thing, CCD, colony collapse disorder. Well, the way I see it, it's more like PCD, people collapse disorder. Honeybees have been around for, we figure, 80-some million years. I think they have the ability to solve problems. I think they're going to continue to be on this world, and they're not going to be extinct. But people, on the other hand, have me a little worried. You know? Bees have been able to tap into the diversity of their ecosystem. They've been the catalyst. They've created that diversity in their evolution with flowering plants. But people, on the other hand, have done more to bend nature to their will and control everything in sterility. And the bees seem to be complaining a little bit about that, as in, like, maybe they're not happy to anthropomorphize, which I'll do all night long. But I knew, even though I was hearing stories and that the bees weren't doing well, that there were hives living out in nature like this. This was in upstate New York. The house had to be knocked down, so they called me to see if I could get this hive out of the wall. And, you know, bee removals are very common down here in Florida, but up north, not so much. They are around, but a hive like this that had 200-some pounds of honey in it, they were huge, 2.5 feet wide by 9 feet tall. And I found the queen early on, and I had that queen for another 2 years after doing this removal. These were like the bees of my dreams. I was humble in front of this hive. How come they could be doing so well for over 20 years, whereas people were telling me that bees were dying left and right? Well, you know, I didn't win my first 6 hives in a poker game. I was actually interested in different systems of farming. I got interested in the permaculture books, this idea of sustainable ecosystems, working with natural cycles rather than trying to shift them and control them. And so it made me want to be a farmer, and I met friends who knew beekeepers in Vermont with 1,000 hives. And they said that I could park my van out back of the honey house and just go to work for a living getting stung. And that's what happened. My first day on the job, I remember before I got the veil on, walking into the bee yard, and I guess I wasn't moving right or a little too loud or something, and the bees just came at me, and I got stung 5 or 6 times in my head before I knew what was going on. And so I ran. I booked it out of there. I ran like 100-some yards away, and I started catching my breath. The bees calmed down. I sat down and started picking the stingers out of my neck, and I looked at this beautiful blue sky and this green field on this Vermont spring day, and I waited to see if I was gonna die. And I didn't die, and somehow I finished out that first day, and for some reason I came back the next day, and at that point I was totally hooked on beekeeping. I realized it was the hardest thing I had ever done, and that's why I wanted to stick with it. And I open with this story not to intimidate you new beekeepers, because these days getting stung is my favorite part of keeping bees. If you don't get stung, the honey doesn't taste as sweet. Really, beyond just its physical benefits, reversing arthritis, multiple sclerosis, I just know that the fact that I can get stung every time I open up a hive means that I need to be wide awake. I need to be focused, paying attention, and I need to hone in on what I'm doing and slow down. Whereas all society growing up, I was just taught to speed up, hurry up all the time. You can't do that with bees, or else, you know? So you'll all figure it out in time. Then getting stung is part of keeping bees, and it's really not that bad. And that first year with 1,000 hives in Vermont, they were stationary. We went out and harvest honey without shirts on. You know, the bees were actually pretty gentle once you learn how to be zen and move around them, slow, deliberate motions. It takes some practice, that's for sure. So I was out there for a couple months, just learning about bees and bee biology, running a bee business with 1,000 hives, what that entails. When it seemed all my friends were moving to Brooklyn in New York City, I decided on a whim to move out to Montana. And I got a job with a beekeeper out of the phone book my first day there, and I signed up for a 5,000 hive operation. 4 hives on a pallet, we picked them up with forklifts, we put 500 hives on a semi-truck, and we shipped those 2,000 miles to Central California to rent them out to the almond groves. During that bloom, it lasted a couple weeks. The bees did the pollination. Then right after that bloom was over, we scooped them up again. We sent them up to Washington to pollinate apples. Then after that, we brought them home to Montana to pollinate cherry trees around Flathead Lake. And we did some melons and vine crops through the year. They made a little bit of honey through the rest of the summer, but mostly we were just revamping these bees to do this pollination circuit again. These guys worked so hard. and they were so clever and innovative at what they were doing that they really earned my respect. Though, of course, this kind of lifestyle, having to wake up in your morning, you have to medicate your bees, you have to feed your bees, and you have to move your bees thousands of miles in order to make ends meet, it's not an attractive livelihood. And that's the main problem that these guys are facing, is that there's not a lot of young blood coming into this industry, and when they realize that this is what you have to do to keep bees alive in this system. What's happening here? These bees are going from farm to farm that is poisoning and malnourishing them. When it's just miles and miles of sand and nutrient solution in these almond groves, you can just imagine that it's just a banquet for certain pests. So there's a lot of pesticide use, and the bees don't get a diverse pollen sources. They need more than one kind of plant to be eating, but they don't get that when they're in a monocrop area. So going from farm to farm, you add on the stress of being on the road, it's really no secret why bees are dying. And then on top of all of that, when things do go right, you get things like this, a landslide in California. They couldn't even get the forklift off the truck to unload those bees. This was in Texas 2 years ago when the floods started, and these bees were trying to do the best they could, see how they're trying to bubble out here and there to survive that. It's like total lost situations when these guys are working so hard to have clean bees and enable the pollination. I mean, these commercial bee guys, they work so hard to enable food production in the U.S. I mean, the U.S. is a net food importer. We're not even feeding ourselves anymore. What food we do make is enabled by these commercial beekeepers who do this migratory pollination these days. So this is what I thought the bees were telling me, but I saw a lot of alternatives. You know, it wasn't I didn't see a lot of future in this kind of farming, the complete control farming with the sterility and the rows and rows of the same crops. And if anything, the bees were telling us that it didn't work out. It wasn't working out for them. And finally, commercial beekeepers started speaking up to the media to the point that the media picked up the story. They called it colony collapse disorder, and the whole country started bugging out, literally. So I was out there doing this pollination out in Montana for about almost 2 years when I got a call from my first boss in Vermont. He told me that his bees were dying. He normally ran 1,000 hives. He was down to 500 hives going into that fall. And he decided on a whim to call a couple of his friends, find some bee yards down the coast in South Carolina, and ship his bees. He had to gather them up by hand. He didn't have a forklift. So he put what 500 hives he had left on a semi-truck and took them down to South Carolina. He was tied up in the marketing end of things. He couldn't go down to manage these bees, so he called me up and begged me if I would come back and just do whatever I could. And he stressed the fact that I was going to be all alone. So I said, sure, let's do it. Let's give it a shot. You know, I've been at it for a couple of years at that point, but there's no guarantees in the bee world. So it was the spring of 2005 in the Tupelo swamps of eastern South Carolina that he dropped me off and said goodbye, and I started going through the bees that day, and the next day I had to call him right away and say that another half of the bees had died. He was down to 250 hives from his normal 1,000 that he ran. And the ground was literally crawling with bees that had shriveled wings. They had a virus, deformed wing virus, that is vectored by Varroa Mites, who I sang the song about. You know, so they were devastating these bees. They were chewing up the brood. They were feeding on the pupa, vectoring these diseases. The hives were going backwards and crashing every day. And there was a white strip in every single box, hanging in between the frames there. I pulled up one of these white strips, which I later found out was called checkmite. It was an organophosphate. It was a neurotoxin, really nasty stuff. I pulled up one of these checkmite strips, and there were Varroa mites crawling up and down on the strip that was meant to kill them. The mites had developed resistance. So the checkmite had replaced Apistan. Apistan was the first chemical mite treatment. When the Varroa came in the late 80s, they hit them with Apistan. And it only worked for a couple years. The mites developed resistance. They replaced it with checkmite, and now I witnessed the checkmite failing. I was looking around, and I realized that there must be another way. You know, I was 24 years old at the time. I was responsible for millions of little lives, and I really had no idea what I was doing. So I explained all this to the boss, and next day, 12 liters of formic acid showed up on my doorstep. Formic acid these days is a legal mite treatment for your beehive, but this is before it was legal. This was raw formic acid. I had to figure out how to mix down to the right solution and get some butcher pads and just dip them in the stuff as I held my breath and laid it on the top bars of these hives in a desperate act to try to kill the Varroa mites. I put some sticky paper underneath the hives, and I came back a day later And I took out that sticky paper, and there were rows of these little tiny red Varroa mites, like little tiny red ticks that had fallen from in between the combs. The mite drop was in the thousands. The stuff killed the mites. I was thrilled. I thought maybe we saved all these bees and stuff. Then I realized that they were kicking a bunch of other white stuff out the fronts of the hives. And going through them, I realized that there were no eggs left, there was no open larvae, and that acid had also killed a whole bunch of the queens. So a good, 25% of the queens were killed by the acid. And even though it is considered an organic treatment, and it is a legal product, at the right temperature, at the right dosage, this is what it does to a beehive. It's tough on the mites, but also very tough on the bees. In this desperate act, it was the only thing that I realized would probably save them. And I'm glad I did it. And I've never had to do it again since for anybody's bees. So we had these 200-some stable hives that at least weren't going backwards. And we wanted to expand the numbers, get the operation back up to as close to 1,000 as possible. We didn't have any queens ordered. Typically, a commercial beekeeper would order queens. A lot of them come from California or Texas or Hawaii, and they come in that cage like I passed around. She's already mated. You can make a split, and I'll talk a little bit about making splits. Put that queen in that cage into the side that doesn't have a queen. They take about a day to 2 days to chew through that candy, and then she gets out and she starts laying eggs, and you have an instant new beehive, just like that. Well, in the spring, it can be hard to find queens. They all are pre-ordered, the year before. So the boss said I could just make a split by cutting a hive in half, what's called a walkaway split. You have a strong hive, you take one of the boxes and move it to a new stand in the same yard. Now, one side here doesn't have a queen. The bees will know it almost right away, and they'll start building a queen in her absence. It's an emergency situation. They have lost her pheromones. They will start constructing a new queen to compensate for her. So, and that's what happens when the hive swarms. You have this strong, robust hive. The old queen moves to a new location. In her absence, they are raising a new queen. Well, we really didn't have any hives that were strong enough to do that to. They weren't at this swarming strength yet. So they had been so knocked back by the Varroa mites and then by the Varroa mite treatment. So rather than just waiting for the bees to come along, I was trying to be progressive, and I hooked up with a couple local beekeepers. I did some reading, and I taught myself how to graft. Grafting is a process of picking up a larva with a little tiny tool, and I brought one here to show everybody. This is a grafting tool that's called the Chinese push-button tool, and you can use this flexible tongue to pick up a larva, and then you put this larva into a little tiny queen cup, which I also brought, on a little tiny grafting frame like this. Now, these are tinier than the Langstroth models that I taught myself to do this with, but it's the same basic idea of taking this grafting tool, going to a hive whose characteristics you want to copy, emulate, your breeder hive. So I went through and I picked hives that I thought were showing mite resistance. They didn't have the shriveled wing bees. They didn't have the spotty brood. They seemed healthy and being able to cope with this heavy parasite load. And that's what I wanted to graft from to copy to raise new queens. So rather than having the bees make the choice to say, oh, we lost our queen, we're going to pick this larva and raise it into a queen, I can go in there, and rather than having that one hive raise one queen in the absence of a queen, I can go in there, I can take away the queen, I can take away all the eggs, and I can take away all the larvae. So now they have no ability to raise a new queen bee, no new mama. It's this total manipulative, invasive beekeeping, stressing out this little hive. But I let them sit like that for a couple hours, and then I could put 40 or 50 of these little queen cups in there, each with a larva from the genetics that I want to copy, and I can get 50 queens from that one box. And those 50 queens go into 50 little splits about 10 days after I do this graft. So I'm going to pass around a queen cup and this little handy-dandy Chinese push-button grafting tool. My problem was, when I was here learning how to do this, I didn't have that fancy grafting tool that costs all of $2.99 at any bee supply place. So I taught myself how to do it with a paper clip. And it was a tough go. I was doing everything wrong. I was rolling the larvae out of the cells. That was just mashing them up. I was using sunlight to light the larvae. That was just frying them. It was really about 7 or 8 attempts of me trying to get these queen cells started before they actually worked. Really, the only thing that helped it work was when the Tupelo trees bloomed in the swamps. It's that famous Tupelo honey that you heard of. That that Tupelo honey flow was so forgiving. For me, being so young and really not knowing what I was doing, trying these new methods, it was very forgiving, and actually the queen cells started working, they started to grow, and then 10 days after I did this graft, I would take each one of the ripe queen cells, I'd make a split from another hive, and each little baby hive, each little nucleus, little nuke hive that I made that didn't have a queen would get one of these queen cells. So I put this little queen cell into one of these little splits. And
wax or plastic back then?
they're a little bit of everything. We're going to get there. But so that queen, the virgin queen, the unmated queen, will emerge from that queen cell in a day or two. Then about a week later, she goes on a mating flight. She mates with 20 or 30 or more drones, the boy bees, in one flight. Yep. And then she'll come back and start laying eggs. And in the natural hive's life cycle, you know, an older queen will leave in the swarm. They'll raise a queen cell or multiple queen cells in her place. You know, the first one out will kill all the other queen cells. That's the first thing the virgin queen does when she gets out. And then she'll go on the mating flight and start laying eggs, rebuilding the hive's population to a point that they can swarm. Generally up north, this happens once a year, maybe twice a year if you have a good fall flow. Down here in Florida, it's every 2 months, 3 months. I caught 2 swarms in December at my house in Pompano here. It's nonstop down here. We're going to talk a lot about the advantages of being here and what you can get away with with bees. But so that's a little bit of the basics of how a hive starts making queens. It's an emergency, but you can instigate this emergency situation if you want to do this grafting that I passed around the tool for. So I started doing this grafting every day, and it started to work. I was amazed, and I started running out of equipment. I had to start building frames, tapping them together, putting in foundation all night long, just to use it up the next day, and then just do it again and again, day after day after day. Deep cover beekeeping, you know. And then by May, I looked around, and I realized that the operation was back up to 1,000 hives. We had 1,000 singles ready to go. I don't know where they came from. They just appeared. So we hauled them back up to northern Vermont and upstate New York. We put them right on the dandelion honey flow in the spring, and they just took off. 2005 ended up being a bumper honey crop year. They went on to make a really sizable honey crop. They paid for this rescue mission, and my boss told me I had done such a good job, and since I wasn't getting paid very much anyway, that I should take 10 hives. Take 10 hives of this operation for whatever you whatever you want, any hive that you want. Find yourself a bee yard, and this is a bonus for you for doing this rescue mission. So of course, I took 10 hives that I thought were showing natural mite resistance, and those are the last times that any of my bees were ever treated for anything, that spring of 2005. I say I treat them nice, you know? And like I said, I love talking to the South Florida Bee Clubs and the Palm Beach Club, especially because treating bees, once you leave Florida, once you leave South Florida, it's the norm. You know, like everyone treats, or if they don't treat, then they don't talk about it because their neighbors would badmouth it. But it's a different scene, you know? You know, I've had bees, I've come down to Florida my entire life. I've run bees here for the last 12 years and stuff, but you know, I like to say, as backwards as Florida is, and on the bee front, we're really progressive. We're on the cutting edge of it. So that's,
When you first started, did you mate the queens where the hives were, or did you have a separate location?
When I first started, I was just trying to keep up with everything. I knew there were plenty of drones around like that. We talk about setting up an isolated mating apiary. You want your drone producers where your boys are coming from about a half mile in every direction. You don't want them right next to each other, that sort of thing. But I mean, there's ample bees around here and in the swamps where I was learning to do this and stuff. But yeah, you need drones. That's an important half of the equation, for sure. So after doing this rescue mission, I had my own 10 hives. I was psyched. I was calling them survivor stock at that point. I split my 10 hives up to 18, and I put them into winter in Vermont, where it gets to be 40 below zero. And I wished them well. I wrapped them. I put on mouse screens. And I realized I was still broke, and I wanted to go into a queen rearing, breeding type program, but I needed to make some money and get a little more experience before I really cut off ties or stopped working for other people. So I answered an ad out of the American Bee Journal magazine for a beekeeper over in Fort Myers, who at that time had 15,000 hives. And I was introduced to a whole new set of pests and problems, 4 different species of ants that will wipe out a beehive down here. But of course, the main nightmare one was this little bugger, the small hive beetle. At this point in my beekeeping career, I had seen devastating Varroa mite attacks, all kinds of American foul brood, pesticide kills, starvation, all kinds of terrible stuff, but nothing gives me nightmares like small hive beetles. It's just the most disgusting thing. And back then, in 2005, when this was, the bees really didn't have a lot of defenses. They didn't seem to really recognize the beetles as a pest. They had only been here a couple years in Florida, and the bees would seem to perk up when a beetle scurried by and then go back to work, until eventually the bees started recognizing these beetles as pests, and then they would try to sting them, try to attack and sting them. They can't sting through that shell, so then I watched as the bees started learning how to corral the beetles into the corners of the hives, and then they started keeping them there, and they started building these little propolis prisons to keep the beetles in jail. And these days, I'm watching a beetle trying to get into a beehive. The bees will take it, flip it upside down, grab its legs, and fly away with it. I'm starting to feel bad for the beetles now. Something shifted. It took like a decade like that, but we keep all our bees in the full sun. High and dry, full sun, morning, noon, and night, like as much as possible. And it seems to really help with the beetle numbers. And if you have really serious, when you see a couple dozen, that's just a normal hive in Florida. Once you start seeing hundreds, that's the problem, because, in times of stress, if you get a cold night and the bees go into cluster, that's when the beetles can really run around and do some damage. In that case, you might want to use a little mineral oil or one of those brawny Dynamax towels. Those seem to work. They get all fuzzy and the beetles get caught in them. There's several different traps that really work if you're seeing hundreds, because that can be a problem for your bees. But in spite of the beetles and all the different troubles of keeping bees in Florida, I learned the potential of the constant pollen and constant nectar coming into the hives, and why so many beekeepers from all around the country come to Florida to overwinter, because the bees just do so good down here. It's amazing. So,
You have snow bees?
Yep, snow bees. That's me, man. Well, so I did a stint through the winter over in Fort Myers, learning about southern beekeeping management. I went back up to Vermont, and I saw that 12 of my 18 hives had survived. I was thrilled. I knew I wanted to keep this stock, but I also wanted to keep a commercial beekeeping job for another year to make enough money to really go out on my own, buy me some time, really. So I struck a deal with my boss in in Montana, rather, that I could do migratory pollination through his business one more year, and I could lease 100 hives from him. So I wanted to continue this stock I had started in Vermont, so I took the 5 best queens that overwintered in Vermont, and I took them with their bees, and I put them into cardboard 5-frame nuke boxes. Hold 5 deep frames, the bees, the brood, the queens. So I had 5 of these, and I loaded them into my Subaru, and I headed out to Montana from Vermont, and about halfway through the second day, the bees were chewing through the cardboard boxes. My little Subaru was filling up with bees, but I made it there okay, and I took these 5 hives and I put them in an isolated canyon away from the 5,000 hives that was the business I was working for. And I started grafting with that grafting tool, 2,000 cups a week. They didn't all work, but I just went for it and just went all out. So I started selling extra queen cells, extra queens to other beekeepers in the Northwest. I took my 100 hives, I split them into 200 with the queens that I raised. And really the whole goal was to have these 200 hives the next spring ready to go to California. And that's where I sent them, except for the 5 hives that I kept in my backyard in Montana, in the canyon. And I started getting those bees off of their foundation. I realized if I wanted to be treatment-free, I had to take a different approach of I was running these bees through a commercial situation, through a high-stress deal. It's where commercial beekeepers lose a lot of bees. So I figured I wasn't going to try to treat the symptoms. I saw the Varroa mites not as the cause of the bee's demise, but more as the symptom. And everyone's trying to treat the symptom, but they never look lower to really find the cause, just that the bees are out of balance, like that. So rather than trying to treat the symptom, I was going to empower the bees. And the only way I saw to be able to do that was take stress off them. So I got them all off of any plastic or anything artificial that they were living on. I let them draw their own natural comb. And I was just thinking about what to do next with my time. I had made enough money now from sending these 200 hives to pollination that after years of working at minimum wage, I was ready, I thought, to go out on my own. So I gave up the 200 hives I was leasing. I had my 5 hives on natural comb in my backyard. And suddenly CCD hits the media and the whole country starts going bee crazy. I decided it was time to come back to the East Coast and see if I could build up the numbers. So rather than going back to the Northeast, New York, where I'm from, I took those bees first down to Florida, where I had learned the ropes, where my dad was living, and he still lives down here at the time. And I realized I could really save myself years of taking advantage of the natural honey flows. I would save myself years and also thousands and thousands of pounds of sugar, artificial sugar feeding, because it's just so good. The honey flows are just so good here in Florida. So I had these 5 hives, and as I brought them down to Florida, I got another job with a beekeeper down here based out of West Palm Beach, Harvey's Honey. They ran about 4,000 hives down from New Jersey to South Florida and then also out to California. And I just signed on to be their queen raiser. And they were just a great, great company to work for. I lived in the mating yard. I took care of 800 of these 5-frame boxes like that. And my job was just to catch queens, put them into these little tiny cages, and then raise the queen cells by grafting to replace them after I caught them. And that's all I did on rotation. And it really amazed me that these were commercial bees. They were living on just regular plastic comb, nothing special about the small cell, natural, less stress comb for the bees. And they also weren't a special stock. I was considering that my bees that I brought down were survivor stock. They had mite-biting tendencies, or what we call Varroa-sensitive hygiene. They can smell mites in the cell and will remove them more often than other bees. But these were a typical Italian commercial bee stock, and these guys are mostly just interested in having a large hive for February almond pollination. That's where the money is in the industry. So they haven't been bred in any way for Varroa mite resistance, but the brood always seemed to look like this. It was a pretty solid pattern. This is a healthy brood pattern. You have some misses here, but that's always the case. But they didn't have high mite levels, and what I realized was happening was that I was breaking the brood cycle in these hives. What that means is that the queen is always in the hive and she's just laying until the hive gets too crowded and they swarm. What happens when the hive swarms is that the old queen leaves with about half the bees, and they have to go through this queen raising process back in the parent position, and you have almost 3 weeks of no eggs being laid in that hive. 90% of the Varroa mites are always inside this brood. They're hiding from these adult bees who have this grooming and biting behavior. They'll actually pick the mites off of each other and bite them. But when they're hiding in the brood, the worker bees can't get to them. And so when a mite emerges from this brood, the first thing the mite wants to do is jump onto an open larva right before it's capped. And 2 weeks later, she's laid a male mite and several female mites. They inbreed in that cell every 2 weeks. So it's like no wonder that they change so quickly. And I realized that the whole chemical treadmill is just like, it's not going to be a sustainable answer. It's just going to get worse and worse. Keep making the mites stronger and supporting the weaker bees. But I realized breaking this brood cycle was just a mechanical thing you could do without any chemical controls that actually simulates what bees do when left to their own devices. That hive swarms, they go through this break in the brood cycle. It's like a time of rest or like fasting, or like it's a cleansing period for the brood nest. It's almost like the bees know what they're doing. Of course, letting your hive swarm from a commercial standpoint is like half of your money flying out to the woods, but I like to say that dead bees don't make any honey. But so that's one of the things that I realized and I incorporated into my business to clean up the brood. If I ever see a problem, if I ever see a miscolored larva or something that's melting down, I'll requeen them. I will requeen them with a queen cell or a swarm cell or a mated queen or something like that. And that is often enough of a break in this cycle to just reset them, and they'll be a lot healthier a month down the road from that. So I had these 5 hives in Florida. And through the power of grafting, using that little tool that I passed around, I was able to turn my 5 hives into 160 3-frame nukes. That sounds like a whole lot of bees, right? But I was really just taking a 10-frame deep box. I was putting 2 sheets, the 2 dividers made out of masonite, and I had 3 little baby hives in each box. It was really just about a pickup truck load worth of bees. But I was able to do that, go from 5 to 160 in less than 2 months, because I taught myself how to graft. Grafting is not something that every beekeeper has to learn. It's easy to raise queens in your backyard. just with natural swarm cells, natural emergency cells, and I'll touch base on that. But if you really want to make your numbers jump, if you want to go from 10 hives to 100, I think in Florida, down here, you could go from 10 hives to 200 hives in a single year, no problem. But learning to graft is going to get you the most queens, because each one of those hives needs a queen. And you want them to also have characteristics that you want in your apiary. You want them to have good temperament, you want them to make honey, you want them to have resistance to all the diseases and mites and beetles and moths and stuff that are down here. All of those factors depend on the genetics of that queen. You change the queen, you change everything about the hive's profile. So it's pretty fascinating in that regard. Back to my story, I had these 160 hives in Florida, and I got them inspected, I got my trip permit, and I started making some calls in New York, where I had friends that were starting to buy farms, who had spots for bees, and I found 15 bee yards in New York to put these nukes that I had raised in Florida. I set them again on the dandelion flow, and I sat back and watched, and they were all on natural, beautiful new comb. They were these survivor genetics that I had raised and kept track of, and I looked around, and I didn't see another frame or another box or anything to put my growing bees into, and I had burned through all my pollination money at that point. I was broke again, so I had no choice really but to stumble on what I consider to be the real mission of anarchy apiaries. It's to bring the means of production back to the beekeeper, to make beekeeping a lot simpler, a lot more affordable, a lot more approachable, and a lot less complicated than it has been made over the last century and a half. So let's do a little history lesson. Let's go back before 1851, before Lorenzo Langstroth patented the movable frame hive. Everyone had their own bees. You know, you talk to people and like everyone's grandparents, great-grandparents had bees. You had dogs, cats, and bees. I'm talking every farm, school, church. But there really wasn't a commercial bee industry. Honey was rarely, if ever, bought or sold, but everyone had a little bit of honey because there were just bees everywhere, and they were pretty much just wild, you know? You would make a straw basket, you know, a skep like this that goes back to medieval times, or you would hollow out a log or just make a bee gum, they called that, or just hammer 4 boards together and make a box hive, any hollow space. The bees would go in, they'd swarm out to the woods, sometimes they'd come back. In medieval times, they would sulfur and kill off half of their skeps to harvest the honey. They would save half of the bees to swarm in the spring and repopulate the half that they had killed. So it sounds kind of barbaric to kill off half of your bees, but I think thousands of years of killing off some of your bees is probably why our bees are so gentle these days. I mean, if you're going to kill off some of your hives to get their honey in the fall, like you're going to choose the one that stung you earlier in the year. But I don't know, I'm just making all this stuff up. So. But anyway, in a hive like this, even if you're trying to harvest the honey and not kill the bees, that's what ends up happening anyway, because it's so messy, so sticky. Bees get mashed, feelings get hurt. It can be a bad scene. So when this movable frame came around, it was just such a game changer, because now you could take apart the entire hive. You could split it in half rather than letting the bees swarm. But the main changing factor was that now you could take this comb of honey, and rather than mashing it and straining it, like was done for thousands of years, now you could put it in a centrifuge, spin the honey out of the comb, and then give that empty comb back to the bees. And they would just fill it up with honey again. Previously, bees had to make brand new wax in order to store the honey every time they wanted to store honey. But now, if they could take all those resources, rather than having to build the wax for their bodies, they could just use all that energy, all that surplus stuff just to make these huge honey yields. And it worked great. It worked great for decades until about the 1880s, 1890s, when contagious diseases started spreading from hive to hive and then from bee yard to bee yard. The main one, of course, being AFB, American foul brood. It's a highly contagious spore-forming bacteria which can't be killed. It can be irradiated or it can be burned. But otherwise, it'll live in your equipment for over 70 years. And what will happen is if a hive gets this and gets sick and crashes, a neighboring hive will come in and try to rob the honey out of that hive, take it back to their hive, and get infected. And as they feed these spores to the brood melts down, the nurse bees try to clean it up, and then they're just spreading the infection, and they can just go from hive to hive until it can infect every hive in the neighborhood, even bees that you don't know or don't see, living up in trees, or neighbors' bees that you didn't know what's there. It was a serious, serious issue. and people started going out of business. They couldn't keep this under control. So what this new budding bee industry decided to do was put pressure on every state government to ban hives that you couldn't inspect. This skep here, even though it's still like the public mindset, like image of a beehive, is not a legal beehive in Florida or like most states in the country. And that's for a good reason, because you cannot go into this hive and look for AFB. And if this hive gets sick, you wouldn't be able to tell unless you really like just destroy the thing. And then by that point, it might already be too late. So because of this AFB is the reason why we want to register our hives in Florida. It's the reason that we have bee inspectors, is to help spread this thing. Because I know commercial guys who couldn't get this under control and have gone out of business because of it. So it's something that every beekeeper ought to familiarize themselves with, is American foul brood. And if you see some weird looking brood, sunken cappings, or like melting down dark colored goo in the cells, take a little toothpick or a little stick, swirl it around. If it's stringy, if it's really gooey, like gooey and it's about an inch to a half an inch to an inch as it goos out of the cell, you might have a serious disease that you want to, talk to a mentor, talk to somebody in the club, or call Chris, our bee inspector. I mean,
Pine needles work well too.
Yeah, pine needles work. Call somebody, do something about it. Yeah, it's an important part. I mean, it's like, because I don't want my bees like close to that kind of thing. It's like nobody does. And because of the state inspection programs, it's really been suppressed over the years. That it's a much more rare thing, but it does flare up, especially in times of stress, bad years, wet years, dry years, things like that for the bees. We see more instances of it. So,
Smells bad.
yeah, it's also pretty stinky.
Special smell.
So AFB, yeah, I can go on and on about it, but it's something that everyone ought to familiarize themselves with. But it changed the industry because now everyone suddenly couldn't have their own bees anymore. To be legal, to oblige by the law, you had to have an inspectable hive. And rather than your straw basket or your hollow log, the only model that folks were presented with was the Langstroth Beehive. It was the Industrial Revolution. Everything was getting standardized, and suddenly this Langstroth concept became a monopoly. Everyone converted over to Langstroth who wanted to still keep bees. A generation went by and all other methods of beekeeping were forgotten. Beekeeping went from this common thing that everyone did to what it is today. Even in our recent renaissance in the interest in beekeeping, it's still a fraction of a percent of our population are beekeepers. It's getting to be more and more, and that's a good thing. We need more beekeepers, but all for the reasons that now that you couldn't make your own hive. If you ever tried to make your own Langstroth equipment, I've tried, it didn't go so well. It went great at first until I tried to get the frames out of the box. Yeah, building your own hive for free, it became, you have to have this inspectable brood nest in there. So I was thinking about all this stuff when I had these 160 little nukes with no boxes to put them in. And so I was reading on the internet, I was calling around people like, what do I do? How do I build a box for these growing bees? They're starting to swarm. So I read about the Peace Corps in the 70s and 80s working in countries like Kenya and Ethiopia, building their own hives on site, a lot simpler than the Langstroth model, and they were calling them Kenyan top bar hives. It was just a trough with sticks laid along the trough, and the bees were making their combs along those sticks. Yeah, seems like simple enough. Well, it is pretty simple. I'm gonna do a magic trick here now. I'm gonna make a Kenyan top bar hive appear out of thin air. Well, it's basically thin air, These are baby blue ones. I have baby pink ones as well. There you go. That's a beehive. All right, I'll turn it on its side so you can see what's going on. You got like your wall here. It's called a top bar hive because the top bars, these bars right here, actually form the roof. So you have several of these sitting on top, and they sit directly next to each other to form the roof, and that's where the bees grow their combs off of, just like so. Let me get you another picture like that. So this one had flipped over in New York in an ice storm. These top bars were actually frozen to the ground and I had to pry them back up. But you can see the amount of propolis that my bees make. Propolis is your friend in a hive like this, as opposed to a Langstroth hive trying to pry up the frames and they just break or get the boxes apart, So that was one thing I realized that, well, I was building a hive like this, even a 3 or 4 foot long trough like this for less than $5 of rough cut lumber I was getting right from the sawmill. I was bringing them a jar of honey. They were giving me twice what I was paying for. You know, so for one thing, it was cheap. I could build a box for less than $5, but really, these days, you show me a dumpster, I can build you a couple beehives out of the contents. The whole point of this kind of beekeeping is using what you have. And you can think of this like a Langstroth hive on its side. You know, whether it's a horizontal hive like this or a vertical one like a Langstroth, the bees tend to keep their brood nest closest to the entrance, which I always put on the side of my boxes, usually down here. So they keep their brood nest close to that. That's where they can ventilate it the best. And they put their honey storage furthest from the entrance. That's where they can guard it the best. So if you got some old pallet wood or anything that's not pressure treated, I really recommend you build up one of these because it's just a simple thing. And the bees do seem to really like these boxes. The dimensions aren't important, but we all use the top bar beekeepers, the Kenyan style, has this trapezoidal shape because there's not a lot of weight down low. If this was in a box with straight sides, what would happen is that the bees would attach their comb to the sides of the boxes, and you'd have to cut that in order to get the bars out. The side attachments are very minimal, and you can actually pick up several combs at once, and really 2 motions, you can be right into the middle of the brood nest, like that. This is my buddy Kirk Webster. He's up in Vermont. He raises Russian bees, treatment-free, and he's not a top bar guy. He's a Langstroth guy. He wouldn't be caught dead working a top bar hive. So this is like a blackmail photo, but Kirk, I always give him a shout out because he was one of the early guys who was really supportive and saying that you can run a bee business and not have to treat for Varroa. And he's been at it for a long time at this point. I think 20-some years he hasn't treated. So some of the advantage of this kind of hive, well, for one thing, there's no heavy lifting. It's not like you have a huge Lang hive, you want to get in the brood nest, make sure your queen's okay. You have to take off all these heavy honey supers, stack them on their end. Has anyone here ever lifted like a 10-frame deep full of honey? I'm sorry for you. It's like 90, 100 pounds. You know, friends don't let friends lift deeps. It's like a common phrase. So, but this is a Langstroth hive that I made. It's just a long Langstroth hive, you know. So it takes your standard deep frames, or you can put top bars on it. You can make it as long as you want to, and you don't have to stack it all up and make it so tall and avoid those heavy boxes. You can just harvest by the 1 frame, 1 comb at a time. You think that would be more popular, you know?
So those are full frames, not top bar?
These are top bars on the edges, and these are regular standard deep frames, you know. You can make them even deeper than that. This is your world, you know. It's like, people ask me what is the best hive design. I see top bars, I see Warrior hives, Langstroth, all this stuff. And my answer is, the best hive design is the one that you make yourself, right? Isn't that cute? So these are my friends in the Caribbean. They made these out of bamboo slats that they just hacked down with hand and wove. The really pretty hives. This is wicker that they harvested and soaked and wove into the basket. And you can see the bees out here, they're propolizing all the holes in the wicker. Bees are very forgiving of poor carpentry, thankfully. They plug up everything with that propolis. It's really good. I know people who chop barrels in half, just lay sticks on them. This is a viable beehive.
You won't attach to the sides of that either?
Nah. Nope. They see it as the floor. We do put a cover over this, like a piece of sheet tin or a piece of plywood, keep them out of the sun, the rain. In the middle of summer, you probably want to add some sticks here to get it off so that whatever lid you have isn't sitting right on these bars. They keep them from getting too hot, like so. But like I said, the dimensions aren't important. Shape for the strength of your combs. And I eventually did my dimensions just so it could accommodate a Langstroth frame, because I had Langstroth hives, but I pulled the end bars off, I pulled off the bottom bar, and I trimmed the comb back to this trapezoidal shape. And it's like therapeutic for me to chop up Langstroth equipment for some reason. And so the edges of that Langstroth bar sit right on the edges of my top bar dimensions. But it's all very personal. There's no 2 top bar beekeepers who have the same dimensions, really. And I kind of like it like that.
Right in a nuke or something if you had to.
Yeah.
Just to temporarily move it.
Yep, totally. There is one important dimension, and that is the width of these bars, like that. I use 1 1/4 inches. It's slightly thinner than the 1 3/8 that is a Langstroth bar, but I have natural comb bees, so they also make smaller cells. The combs are also a little bit narrower, and 1 1/4 inches seems to work really well in the brood nest. once they get to their honey storage area, things can get a little crazy. They can start making combs that are a little fatter and a little fatter. So we use something like this, like a spacer, just a 1/4 inch spacer. Once you see that that comb is starting to bulge off the side of the top bar, like that, you put in a spacer like this, so hopefully the next bar is also inspectable like that. So this is a hive that you have to inspect like pretty regularly, especially in the spring, like right now when they're starting to make lots of honey, making lots of new wax. You want to get in there every 10 days, 2 weeks, just to keep the comb straight. Because if you have a comb curve a little bit, the next comb will curve a little bit more, and then you're going to have a comb that's going across 5, 6 bars at once. At that point, you have a hollow log, which the bees won't care about. They'll love it in there. But the point of building this hive and having it so it's inspectable, so it's easy. You can go in there and have your little Zen experience and find the queen, and everyone has a good time like that. So 1.25 inch, but having extra spacers to that to keep them pretty much straight is a good deal. And I also give them a little bit of a comb guide. I've tried all different kinds of stuff. I think a tiny bit of wax foundation, like a 1-inch strip of wax foundation works really good. I've seen people use molding, like furniture molding, making a triangle. But more often than not, I've used popsicle sticks. I cut a shallow groove in this bar and I glue in 4 popsicle sticks here, giving them this wooden ridge for them to hopefully start their comb straight. So, I had to cut 5,000 top bars last year. I had to eat 20,000 popsicles just to support my beekeeping habit. Yeah, right. But so some sort of comb guide. Yeah, and they don't always do it. It's like it's organic, It's not, I think Winnie the Pooh said it best. You never can tell with bees. So you don't know what they're really gonna do. We do feed some nukes sometimes because we're building up bees and we sell queens to people. And in the top bar, you can feed them in the back, just like so. We also produce package bees from them. So rather than just like taking away 5 of their combs and like cutting up the body of the hive, we'll just simulate swarming. We'll see that a hive we have is about to swarm. We'll go in, we'll find the queen, and we'll just take 2-3 pounds of bees as if they had swarmed. We're working more closer to the bee biology that way. And we'll use these extra swarm cells and emergency cells. So this is something that you can do whether you have a Langstroth hive or a top bar hive. I don't try to convert everyone to be a top bar beekeeper again, but after years of doing only Langstroth hives, the first year that I went to top bars, I learned so much about bees. I was working commercially for 5-6 years before I even knew what a top bar was. That first season, working with these hives, seeing bees doing everything from scratch the way they want to do it, I became a better beekeeper. So I would recommend everyone has 1 or 2 in their backyard. Even if you're not going to convert, you would learn a lot about bees and what they want to do. It's just a fun project. It won't cost you anything. But so something else you can do in your backyard, right, irregardless of what kind of hive you have, is raise your own queens. I'm a big advocate of this because I run about 1,000 hives these days. My long-term goal is to work down to 5 hives, a fishing pole, a hammock, and a network of us beekeepers who have 5, 6 hives in our backyards. Even just 3 is good enough. Like in a bad year, say you lose a hive or 2, you know how to make splits. You know how to take your best hive, split it, either with a swarm cell or a natural cell or just moving the queen so they raise one in her place. Replace your dead hive so you don't have to buy bees from another part of the country or someone who just got back from California bringing all kinds of diseases and new mites and things. If you can raise your own, that's my goal of being here, teaching you that you can do this. You don't have to do the fancy grafting or anything like that. You can just recognize a swarm cell, a nice cell like that, on the edge of the comb right next to a queen cup that's still open right there. And you can use that to requeen that hive that's been nasty or stinging the dog and stuff. Or you can just use it to make more hives. So, split your hive in half. What you can do is you have a strong hive here, pick up the entire hive, move it to a new spot in your backyard. Let's say you're not good at finding the queen. This is a way you can do it without having to find the queen. You just make sure you want to not find the queen is the thing. So take your big hive, move it to a new spot in your backyard. Where it was, put a new box. It can be a top bar, a lang, whatever. And then go to the hive that you moved and move back some combs of brood and nectar and honey and stuff. Give them back some resources here because here's where they get the field force. All the field bees will be coming back. Even if you move the field bees over here, they're going to come out, reorient, and go back to where they remember their home being, and you'll end up with a pretty equalized 2 hives from 1 that way. So the idea being you picked up the entire hive, moved it here, your queen and most of your brood and everything is right here. The brood that you move back to this new position, make sure there isn't a queen on it. Or if you see the queen, that's great. You can like leave her there or leave her here. Whichever side doesn't have the queen, give them a queen or make sure they have the resources to build one. You can get a mated queen, just like one of these, either from me or some of the other people here who raise them, because she's already mated. She'll get through this candy in about a day or two and start laying eggs, and then they'll start to grow right off the bat. Or you can just give them some eggs and larvae. They'll raise their own. And especially if you have like some mite issues or things like that, you know, they'll go through that like broodless cycle that helps them cleanse out some of the stuff that they've got going on. So there's a lot of different ways to do that, but that's a pretty easy way just to make a simple split in your backyard. And say even if you got like swarm cells or things like that, you go into one hive, you got a bunch of swarm cells. You got a swarm cell like this on 4 different combs. Well, say you got 4 different hives in the yard. Move those 4 hives to new stands, put an empty box in each one of those 4 places, just drop one of these swarm cells in each one. You just doubled your apiary like that, a piece of cake, you know? So it's just learning to recognize these resources, where they're at, where you can find them, and the timing of what to expect when you do this. And I really recommend that you all give it a shot and be active beekeepers. I still do grafting, quite a bit of grafting. This is grafting into a top bar. You can do all different kinds of manipulations, the same as the Langstroth ones. But I was getting to the point where I was like wondering, I'm doing these alternative boxes, and like I don't want to do any kind of treatments or antibiotics or like much supplemental feeding. Like where do I really fit in? Like I know that small is beautiful, but then I know of beekeepers like this who do amazing stuff. This is the Kona queen operation on the Kona coast of Hawaii. They're the largest queen producers in the world. When I visited them, this was about 10 years ago, they were producing about 300,000 queen bees. That's a lot of bees. And they have this really cool way of doing it that I'll just explain briefly. So they got like a double nuke here. This is like a 5-frame nuke on top of another 5-frame nuke and a double nuke here. There's a queen on this side of the box and a queen on this side with a brood nest and a brood nest. Going over the tops of those 2 double nuked hives is a queen excluder that spans the roof of both boxes. And then a single box is on top of that queen excluder. And there's a pipe that goes down the row of each one of these like rows of cell raisers. That pipe gets hooked up to a giant mechanical bellows that blows smoke down the length of this pipe with little offshoots underneath each one of these little hives. The smoke drives the young bees upwards through the queen excluder into this top box. And once they have enough young bees in that top box, they put in a piece of sheet tin, they put a slide in there, and that makes that top box queenless. And they let that top box sit queenless for a couple hours, and then they put their graft in, using the tool with the cups like that. And they can start the cells that way in an emergency queenless situation. Then as soon as those cells are started, they take the slide back out a day later after the graft, and the bees will continue to finish the queen cells up there, even though they have a laying queen here and a laying queen there. They go into more of a supersedure mode. The queen's pheromones stay down low in these brood nests, and even though the cells were up here, the cells got started in a queenless emergency situation, and now they're being finished in a queen-right supersedure type situation like that. And so this is just a way that they can do it again and again and again, and it runs like clockwork, and I was really impressed. It's a bit larger scale than I knew I was ever going to be, but I was just fascinated by what people can do with bees, and the giant mechanical bellows was just like this big funky machine.
There's a screen on the bottom, that's what you said?
Yeah.
The smoke goes in?
Yep. Everything had a screen bottom so the smoke can blow up there, but they get run through a queen excluder that gets blocked off like that. So this method is adapted by a beekeeper in New Zealand named Harry Cloak. And it's come to be known as the Cloak board method, which is a convenient name. His name was Cloak, but what it does is cloak the queen. The queen will be down low in this box. I put a slide in up here, and I made that top box queenless as a way to start queen cells, like that. So I talked a little bit about that you can make a simple split by just moving your hive, moving back some resources so they can raise a queen. We'll get into some more simple grafting methods now. If you want to make that jump and really jump from 10 hives to 100 hives, grafting gives you the most queens, the most timing, the most numbers. If you really want to like expand your numbers, I recommend trying. It takes a little bit of practice using that tool, but once you get it down, it really becomes the easiest part of raising queens. Setting up the cell raisers is really the art of it. So I recommend looking at the Cloak board if you just want to raise a batch every month or so. You can put that slide in, do the manipulations, do a graft, get a batch of queen cells like that. And then you got to figure out what to do with all these queen cells. So what most commercial queen producers do is they put each cell in a very tiny, tiny hive. They call it a baby nuke or a mating nucleus, something like that. It's a small amount of resources. It's really just a handful or two of bees is all you need to incubate that queen cell and send her out to go on a mating flight and come back. So I started doing little tiny top bars in flower pots, little 6-inch terracotta pots. They were super cute, and they really worked. They drew all this comb, and I was able to get queens mated into them. And then I did some reading and that told me, yeah, I was trying to, but I did some reading that told me that the queens really ought to go for 3 weeks or more before you cage them in these little tiny cages for sale. And what they say is that the ovarials are able to develop better. It'll be a longer-lived queen for at least 3 weeks. And these little flower pots were just way too tiny for let the queen get mated and then lay for several weeks like that. So I ended up eating them all. But I got the bees out of them first. I started doing some more experiments here. So I came up with what I'm using mostly today, which is just a simple 12-inch box. I guess the interior is about 11 by 11. And I used to run all these sticks and bars on a table saw until I discovered the forefront of beekeeping technology. It's a barbecue skewer. Yeah. Just a bamboo skewer. I cut it down to 11 inches, and I just staple in a simple bar rest, and I put 8 of these little skewers on the top of the box, and the bees actually just like go to town making little combs off of them. They're cute as can be, like that. This is my evil twin who wears a tie, you know? Not me. And then I got the shiny bubble wrap, Reflectex. You can get it at Lowe's. It's just like water heater insulation that you can just peel back really easily. And when they're only 6 inches deep like that, it's really easy to just get the combs out of the box without having any side attachments and things like that. We can get through these really quickly as little tiny baby hives. And so we have a lot of these things. We have 450 of these little boxes right now, and we do these on a rotation. So to bring you up to speed, I want to talk to you a little bit about the way that we're raising our queens these days, because I've done a little bit of everything, if you notice. In the bee world, migratory pollination, I knew it really wasn't my route and stuff, and I've tried to produce honey and comb honey and things like that, but queens, producing high-quality queens is definitely the most fun. Of going into bees as a means of a livelihood, especially tracking families like we're doing. We're breeding, we're tracking family lines. I have several queens that are still green dots. They're going into their 5th year. Mostly we're raising them off of blue dots. Those are 4-year-old queens. It's pretty neat. And we know because we put a little dot of paint on her back that lasts that long. But this is a mating yard that we used down in Homestead. It was a beer depot, as you can see, and I think the fumes from the beer helped ensure proper mating of the queens. But basically how we work is we got 3 sets of mating nukes. This is a set of 150 little boxes like that. This is a set of 150, and that's a set of 150. And so we work 1 set a week. This set this week, then that one, then that one. And by the time we're back here, 3 weeks have gone by. So what we do is that my sweetheart Tucka and I, we sit on these little red wagons. You know, we have a hand sprayer to keep our hands clean. We don't want sticky queens. We have extra queen cages, and we tuck the queens under the seat to keep them out of the sun. And we go through, and we're harvesting queens and harvesting extra brood. Because every time we go through one of these little tiny boxes, we have to cut them back. Because we're going to leave these bees in here for 3 weeks. And this is a really tiny house for them. So what we'll do is that every time we remove the queen, we'll put her in a little cage. We'll also have to take some of the brood out of that just to cut them back. So in a perfect take, say we have 100% mating on the queens. We will get 150 mated queens, and we'll get at least 150 combs of brood that look like that. That break in the brood cycle, they're almost virtually mite and disease and parasite free. They're super nourished from this break in the brood cycle as well. So I'm more interested in harvesting this brood than I am the mated queens even, because this brood has come to drive the whole operation. This brood is what we use for our cell raisers, where we're raising the queen cells. And we also use this brood, there's just a huge surplus. You can imagine the constant equipment crisis that we're in. We just make tons of splits. So this is how I'm doing my cell raisers. Well, I've been raising queens for 15 years at this point. I don't think I've ever done it the same way twice. There's so many different ways to do it, and they're all fascinating, and they all work in certain situations. But the way that we're doing it now is doing queenless starter finishers. It's always the same box, and it's always queenless, and all we do every week is put more brood into it. So it has tons and tons of young bees, and we graft into this every 7 days. So we'll go in, we'll move last week's graft from the front to the back with last week's brood, and then we put new brood in the front that's all totally capped, like this one, so they can't raise a rogue cell. You know what happens if they raise a rogue cell? She'll get out there, kill all your other queen cells. That's never happened to me before. Has it happened to you, Eric? Yeah, I'm always on time, right? Yeah. Yeah, right. Yes, sir.
For the newest, could you describe why you have to have new bees doing that?
Ah, yeah, good question. So the young bees that are about 2 to 3 days old, start developing their hypopharyngeal glands. The young bees are first house cleaner bees. They scrub the cell that they just emerged from. They scrub everything. But then they start developing these glands in their head, and those glands produce royal jelly. Royal jelly is a superfood, It makes your toes tingle if you eat a lot of it. But it's what the queens make. Every larva gets a shot of royal jelly when it first hatches from the egg. But then quickly the workers are turned more towards a worker jelly, whereas if that same larva, which is a female fertilized, came from a fertilized egg, so it's a female larva, it could either be a worker bee, which is kind of like a stunted, infertile female, like a stunted queen, and the queens are like the full, like fertile. It's a totally different phenomenal thing going on there, but the biology is the same. The fertilized egg can become a worker bee or a queen bee. The only difference that makes her become a queen bee is that she's fed extra royal jelly. Extra sugar, extra vitellogenin, these like super proteins in there. And so you need lots and lots of young bees if you're gonna raise multiple queen cells like this on a weekly schedule. So we just want tons and tons of young bees. You can't have enough young bees. And eventually they start looking like this. This is how you want them to look. You want quality queens. What we're doing is we're simulating swarming conditions. Crowded, lots of young bees, abundant food. We do feed them honey here just for the cell raisers, and natural pollen. We don't do any like pollen substitutes or anything like that. So yeah, this is what you want your cell raisers to look like. They make quality queen cells. This was a perfect take. 40 for 40 in this one. We raise in between 30 and 40 queen cells, and you see the nice little white wax that they've put on every single queen cup. I do use the plastic queen cups that even the most hardcore organic beekeepers I know use plastic queen cups these days, because the wax, even if you don't put chemicals in your hive, there's still chemicals in that wax. They get them from the environment. Wax is like a sponge. You say it's like the liver of a beehive, Any toxin in the environment, any pathogen go into that wax and stay there. So the plastic ones don't have that problem. And I've been reusing the same plastic ones for years. I just let the bees scrub them for a couple days before the graft. Of course, you want to get large queen cells that are well-shaped, well-formed like that. It's confusing to look at this plastic base because often you just see them as all made out of wax. But the one cool thing about the plastic cups is that you can see here that there's some royal jelly left over. That means that larva did not run out of food before she pupated. She had plenty of food, extra food in there. And the idea is to get these huge queens that'll live for 10 years each and like eat mites and make lots of honey and like kiss your kids and stuff like that. So we take this extra brood, we put it out into the outyards and let our hives grow up. We do make some honey, like begrudgingly. We make a lot of comb honey like this. We actually try not to make honey. It's sticky, awful stuff. A honey season, I mean, like everything is sticky. The steering wheel, the stick shift, the doorknob, the dog. It just can get out of control, you know. But we make several thousand pounds. We harvest it until we're sick of looking at the stuff, really. But really focus on comb honey and stuff like that. And harvest it in several different ways. I've used bee escapes and like bee blowers, just air blowers and stuff. My favorite way is to take the top box of honey, flip it upside down and put it on the ground by the hive entrance and just start drumming. You can actually just start drumming rhythmically, and the bees start to swirl, and they'll swirl and swirl and swirl around until they get a scent of where their home is, and then they'll all just make a beeline and make this mad rush back home to their box and just evacuate the honey super. This has been done for a long, long time, like driving bees out of logs and skeps and things, so I feel like I'm part of this ancient ritual like that. We also do lots of fun, crazy experiments. We try to do a couple of these every year. This is just glass jars. I took that shiny bubble wrap, cut holes in it, and just put an empty jar on top. And if it's at the right moment with the right hive, with the right honey flow, they just make all this beautiful new comb up into these jars. And we didn't put wax or anything in there. So again, we just pop off that jar, tap the bees out, and put a lid on it, and it's good to go. It's pretty. This is my 7-foot solar wax melter at my house in Pompano. It's a sliding glass door. And just some roofing tin in there, and again, the box is just lined with that shiny bubble wrap insulation again. It's super easy to make, and it's my favorite way to process wax. And it works really well here in Florida. I've had this for years now. Uh-huh.
Does that box close, or do you leave it open like that?
Oh, no, we close it.
Okay.
It can get become a robbing nightmare. So, yeah, but it's on hinges here, the glass door, and you just take these sticks away, and it folds on down, and the wax collects down here. So I'll leave you all with just a few more gadgets and tricks. Every beekeeper ought to have bait hives. There's 2 things I want you all to know about. That's American foul brood, like I mentioned earlier, and also how to put up bait hives, which I figure probably most of you do. Bait hives, a lot of this research comes from Tom Seeley at Cornell, who's studied swarm behavior for decades at this point. He says a hive is looking for about a 10-gallon size cavity. I find here in Florida, like 5 to 10 gallons is usually pretty good. But an old 10-frame deep, about a perfect size. And we've had 5-framers work really well too. But you want to put this in like a good location, a good spot that's in the shade to partial shade. I already told you that I keep all my bees in full sun, but when I put up bait hives, I put them up in the shade. I catch the bees there, and then I move them into my bee yard into the sun. So you got about this 10-gallon cavity box. You want an entrance about 1.5 inches, circular in diameter, and anything you can do to make this box smell like a beehive. I put a piece of old comb. Using a used box is great. But you can paint the inside with propolis or wax, put in an old piece of comb, slum gum that I get from the wax melter, a handful of dead bees, whatever you got. I also put in a little bit of lemongrass essential oil, just a couple drops. The commercial swarm lures will work as well, but just a couple drops of lemongrass oil is really kind of all it takes. Lemongrass is part of their Nasanov gland, their orientation pheromone. So that's what really draws the scouts to kind of check out a house like that. And you'll find that, usually give it a little time, 100% of these will fill up down here. People don't know, like every 3rd house you see around here has a beehive living in it. We are infested. Down there are so many bees. You put up 100 of these, then you'll have a beekeeping operation in no time. Also, if you're in an urban area, like the majority of us are down here, you put up a bait hive and you catch a swarm in your backyard, you probably saved that swarm from going into somebody's wall and getting met by a spray can. So you're really doing these bees a good service. And putting up these bait hives like that, you might get a hive coming out of a wall like this, bees that are gentle and productive and disease resistant, bees that you can't buy anywhere. You can really get some awesome bees going this way. This was one down in the Florida Keys, down in Sugarloaf Key, underneath a trailer that I did. I'll show you a couple of these. And this is my bee vacuum. Probably a lot of you, if you haven't been asked already, sooner or later, you're gonna be asked to get bees out of somebody's house once they know you're a beekeeper. And it's free bees. You're not gonna pay me for them? But the first thing I say is that I'm a beekeeper, not a carpenter. I'm not putting it back together. So this is my bee vacuum. I've built many over the years. This is my favorite, and it's the gentlest one on the bees that I've seen. It's a dust buster. It is a cordless dust buster. This is a Sears Craftsman, or you can get any cordless dust buster like that. Take the front off and put on a 90-degree PVC elbow and cut a hole in the bottom of the bucket. And then in the lid of the bucket, you put in your suction tube. So the bees go into the tube here, and they get caught in this paint strainer bag, a 5-gallon paint strainer. That's the same strainer I use to filter my honey, my wax, and everything, you know, with the top bars, you know, but this is my extractor right here. It's a bucket and a stick. So that paint strainer works really good. The bees have a really nice soft landing in that net, and you have extra batteries. It's super lightweight. It's easy to carry up a ladder. You have extra batteries. You don't have to plug it in. So I recommend we use it more often than not doing a bee removal. So, and if all else fails, you can always eat the bees. Remember that. All right, this is my last shot. This is one of my bee customers up north, you know, with her first package of bees, and she has these beautiful painted top bar hives right here, and it's very ambitious. This is her later in the year without the gear on. You know, she's established this connection. Like, these are her bees, you know. She's rocking it, and I think about this. I think about her a lot. She's in Connecticut, and so. When I do my talks, like I mentioned, you know, my long-term goal is that you all have the sustainable apiary in your backyard. You don't have to buy stuff. You don't have to. You have your own locally adapted bees. But taking it to the next step, you know, you probably all remember the first day that you opened up a beehive. You know, it might have been yesterday. It might have been years and years ago. But I'll never forget that moment when the first lid opened and I was just like, wow, there it is. It's a connection to nature that can't really be mimicked or replaced by anything else. And it's something that we as beekeepers can give to somebody else. So the next time, I would recommend to you, the next time you open up your beehive or look at your bee magazine or read a bee book or go to the bee meeting, bring a young person along with you, because their world will just be opened and expanded in ways that we can't even tell. And if we were all doing this, then we won't end up as the lone beekeeper out in the crowd. So that's about it for my spiel. I'll answer more questions. I can sing you more songs as well.